In this episode, guys, we're going to be talking about 4 different types of interval conditioning sessions that you can be doing to improve your aerobic and anaerobic fitness for your sport, and specifically in this case, hockey. So when we talk about interval conditioning sessions, we mean running-based conditioning sessions whereby you've got work and rest interspersed. So things like running for 30 seconds, resting for 30 seconds would be an example of an interval session, whereas a continuous session would be a 20-minute steady state run. So there wouldn't be an interval in between the conditioning bouts. The effectiveness of interval conditioning has been well documented in research, and in hockey specifically, because the nature of the repeat sprint ability component is really, really impactful on aerobic fitness and also repeat sprint ability, two core components of running performance for hockey players. So these are 4 different types you can use. The first type we've got is intensive. Now, by intensive, we mean intervals that are 10 to 60 seconds in duration, that are 100 to 130% of maximal aerobic speed. Maximal aerobic speed is the lowest speed at which your VO2 max occurs and is basically a base measure of your aerobic fitness. So we're working at speeds above our baseline of aerobic fitness, so clearly very intensive in nature. Generally, this is a 1-to-1 work-to-rest ratio, can be a 1-to-2 work-to-rest ratio, but generally it's 1-to-1. So what you tend to see is an example like 15 seconds of work with 15 seconds of rest at 110% of maximum aerobic speed. That would be quite a common prescription for something like intensive intervals. The effectiveness of this type of session is that we can perform high-intensity work with interspersed recovery periods, allowing us to accumulate lots of high-intensity work in a relatively short period of time. So it meets the demands of hockey in the nature of it being interval-based, intermittent by its nature, and what this means is we can work at speeds above maximum aerobic speed as well. With continuous work, it is basically impossible to work above your maximum aerobic speed, unless you'd miscalculated it, because when you do a continuous time trial run to achieve that, the speed at which you can sustain is your aerobic fitness. So it would be impossible to run faster than that for 20 minutes, for example. So that's the effectiveness. We can work faster than maximum aerobic speed. And a lot of research has shown that if we want to improve maximum aerobic speed, we need to be accumulating distance above 100%, not below it. Extensive conditioning on the opposite side is where we work for between 2 to 6 minutes in duration at speeds between 80 to 100% of mass. So this is below 100%. What we're trying to do here is really accumulate volume of work below 100% of our maximum aerobic speed. You might ask, why would you want to do that if to improve maximum aerobic speed you need to work at speeds above 100%? Well, generally speaking, this is used for different types of adaptations. This is generally a lot more what we call central adaptations, so things like improved cardiac output of the heart, improved delivery of oxygen to the working muscles, for example. So we're trying to improve the efficiency of our ability to uptake and transport oxygen around the body for aerobic work. Intensive intervals, on the other hand, generally lead to slightly more peripheral adaptation. So we're looking at things like at a more local level, things like increased capillarization, increased mitochondrial density maybe, and also just improving things like neuromuscular fitness as well, because we're working at a high intensity. So they can both be used in a program, and if we were going to do 2 sessions per week, you might say one of each would be effective. But we've also got 2 other types of conditioning which we can intersperse with this as well. We've got tempo conditioning, which is a little different from intensive and extensive mass intervals in the sense that we're actually calculating the running speed based off our max speed, not off of our maximal aerobic speed. So just to clarify that, maximum aerobic speed would be, for example, in a 16 pitch lengths run, as fast as you can, the average speed you can sustain will give you your time, and that's your maximal aerobic speed. So it's your sustainable aerobic speed, or the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs. Your max speed, on the other hand, is the fastest speed you can possibly achieve, full stop. So if you can only, even if you did like a 10-meter sprint, and in that 10-meter sprint you achieved 8 meters per second, that's your max sprint speed. So it's a very short burst of speed. To calculate your tempo speed, generally work at around 70 to 75% of that max speed. And we're trying to accumulate high intensity running distance. And that's generally going to be speeds above about 5 meters per second. What this looks like is quite a fast speed, and it's going to be, if you were to compare it to mass, something like 130% of your maximum aerobic speed for 100 meters, maybe 50 meters, maybe 75 meters. So like half pitch length, 3/4 or a full pitch length at around 70% of speed, but with quite a long period of recovery in between. This might be something like a 1-to-3 work to rest ratio. So if it takes you 20 seconds to run one length of the pitch, we're going to recover for about a minute. So 20 seconds times by 3, 60 seconds, that's a minute. So what we're trying to do here is work at high speed, but we're trying to accumulate lots of distance by interspersing it with relatively long periods of recovery. The benefit of this is that we can condition our body for high speed running, so we can accumulate a lot of high speed running, whereas in intensive conditioning intervals with a mass based prescription, it's a bit more difficult to do so at volume, because we're obviously getting a very short period of time between those intervals. So as time goes on, you're going to get more and more fatigued. It becomes harder to do things like sustain your running technique, and you might also find it harder and harder to sustain the distances. Most of the tempo, you can achieve the speeds with the rest periods, which allows you to maintain good running technique and accumulate high amounts of high-speed running. So quite an effective means of training. The final method is called repeat sprint interval training, and this really is the highest intensity training we can do, which is a combination of all these factors. It's basically really high intensity work for short periods with also short periods of recovery. And an example of this might be 5 seconds of all-out sprinting with 30 seconds of recovery in between, repeated. And in terms of like the volumes of all these different sessions, I haven't gone into, but an example there would be something like 5 intervals in succession. So 5 seconds on, 30 seconds off, times by 5, a 5-minute recovery, and then once more going through another set of 5. So really, really high intensity work. And this is getting closer to above sometimes the demands of a match, demands of a tournament. So a really potent stimulus for improving overall conditioning. So the reason why it's short is because it's high intensity. You can't sprint flat out for much more than sort of 5 to 10 seconds. Generally around the 5-second mark is what we'd be tending to look at. And we're working over 90% of max speed. So flat out sprinting. The reason why it's a high work to rest ratio is, again, just very simply because you need the recovery to allow yourself to keep doing this. You couldn't do 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off, because there's no way you could sustain that type of sprinting. So it's still very, very high intensity, but with slightly longer rest periods in between that. So how this would all fit together would be that things like extensive conditioning you probably use during the off season initially, just to accumulate enough running volume whilst the volume of hockey has dropped off. Intensive conditioning can be used throughout the season, really, at different different periods of the season. Can be used during the pre-season, can be used during the in-season. Tempo, generally speaking, is going to be used in combination with things like speed work, because it complements high speed running, high intensity speed work pretty effectively there, but again can be used throughout the season. But repeat sprint intervals would only really be used when you've got the ability to recover between them as well. So you probably wouldn't be doing this hugely during the season, because the nature of the hockey is that you're going to be getting it from the sport itself. So it's probably going to be a pretty potent stimulus you'd use leading into a tournament just before it, or probably just before the start of the season as well. So I hope that's been a useful overview of 4 different types you can use. I'll also put a link down below to an article where I cover off this different elements of conditioning from a maximum aerobic speed and anaerobic speed reserve component as well. But if you like this, please like it and follow it. And if you think anyone else would find this useful, please share it with them as well.